Thank you for coming to Fancy Free Philosophy, learning how society works best by discussing news, history, philosophy, and economics, so you and I have good info to defend liberty.
Today, we'll dig into some important but hidden history. During the era of segregation, Jim Crow, the heyday of the KKK, and rampant racism in the United States, before the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 first instituted minimum wage in America, black teenage unemployment was about the same as white teenage unemployment. Teenage workers are the closest category to low-skill adult workers, so it helps give us a better estimation of how well the more disadvantaged and lowest-skilled adult workers might be doing as well. Today we'll look at just one of the handful of factors that contribute to the wide employment gaps that have persisted since the mid-20th century. We need to know the truth about this and many other things in order to make America an even better place. By using the clarity of data and hindsight to see where we went wrong, we can correct our mistakes to improve the lives of our fellow Americans and our own. Unemployment went up much higher for blacks than whites after minimum wage began. In fact, many racist whites argued for the minimum wage on grounds that it would help white workers not to have to compete with black workers. Partly because of terrible schools, working-class blacks were on average lower skilled and less productive, so the only serious negotiating tactic at their disposal was to compete by working for lower wages. If another guy is more productive than you, then if you offer to work for a lower wage, you might still get the job and get your foot in the door to gain some experience. But for many Americans, especially blacks, this negotiation tactic was outlawed because the government banned any wage below the minimum that they imposed on everyone. The longtime member of the Ku Klux Klan, Alabama Democrat Senator Hugo Black, first drafted the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1932, but the bill only passed 6 years later after some revisions were made, such as a 40-hour work week, 1.5 times overtime pay, and tweaks to some rules for minors, like people under 18. But after a decade, inflation during wartime in the 1940s practically unofficially repealed the minimum wage. When the government's creation, the Federal Reserve, prints and circulates more money into the economy, it lowers the value of each dollar. So if you make $20 an hour, and then 5 years later, there's been 100% inflation during that time, meaning the currency in circulation has doubled. That means you making $40 an hour is, in practical terms, the same wage you were making 5 years ago at $20 an hour, because each dollar is half as valuable. So that gives you an idea of how that works. So after a decade of inflation basically repealed the minimum wage, the result was that again in 1948 to 1949, black teenage unemployment ended up about equal to white teenage unemployment. Let's take a look. In 1948, black 16 to 17-year-olds had 9.4% unemployment, and white 16 to 17-year-olds had 10.2% unemployment, so slightly higher. Blacks aged 18 to 19 had 10.5% unemployment, and whites aged 18 to 19 had 9.4%, so whites had a little bit lower there. But it's about 10% for teens of both races. Then, in 1949, a significant recession hit the economy, and black 16 and 17-year-olds had an unemployment rate of 15.8% during the recession. But that was less than half of what it would be in every year from 1971 to 1997, and less than 1/3 of what it would be in 2009. In 1950, the minimum wage was increased to make up for the inflation, and ever since then, black teenage unemployment has been about 2 to 3 times white teen unemployment for many decades. Since the 1950s, black teen unemployment has never gone below 20%. In the mid-20th century, the 16 to 17 and 18 to 19 age categories were merged into one category. So, from 1971 to 1994, for black males aged 16 to 19, Unemployment never fell below 30% during that entire time period. It exceeded 40% in 9 of those years, and it exceeded 50% for 2 years. And then from 1995 to 2009, for black males aged 16 to 19 again, unemployment ranged from 23.8% to 52.2%, which is just astonishing when you compare it to the late 40s when racism was way worse, and it was like 10%.
I want to read an excellent quote to you from the PhD economist Thomas Sowell. That's Sowell. He happens to be black, which matters to some progressives, but to me, he's an insightful and legendary economist and author. This is from page 233 of his book, Basic Economics, the 5th edition from 2015. It's an excellent book. Quote, "The wide gap between the unemployment rates of black and white teenage males dates from the escalation of the minimum wage and the spread of its coverage in the 1950s. The usual explanations of higher unemployment among black teenagers, less education, lack of skills, and racism, cannot explain their rising unemployment, since all these handicaps were worse during the earlier period when black teenage unemployment was much lower." Unquote. He's great at making things understandable, so reading his books will be very helpful to you. Sowell has certainly taught me a lot. He writes so that if you've never studied economics, you can still clearly understand him. So black teen unemployment was 51% in 2015, just a few years ago. Here's a quote from Bernie Sanders during a Vox interview in 2015. That's Vox with a V, not Fox News. Quote, "You know what youth unemployment is in the United States of America today? If you're a white high school graduate, it's 33%, Hispanic 36%, African American 51%. You think we should open the borders and bring in a lot of low-wage workers? Or do you think maybe we should try to get jobs for those kids? I think from a moral responsibility, we've got to work with the rest of the industrialized world to address the problems of international poverty. But you do not do that by making people in this country even poorer." Unquote. It's astonishing when you compare that 51% for black teens to the 10% that it was in the late 1940s during the height of American racism and segregation. Now think about that. And it was about 10% for white teens, compared to 33% in 2015. One thing that's interesting is that the Nordic countries that Bernie Sanders admires so much have no minimum wage laws. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Switzerland have no minimum wage laws. Yet Bernie wants to raise America's national minimum wage to $15 an hour, while also saying we need to be more like those countries that have no minimum wage. But more to the point, America used to have more entry-level jobs that gave completely unskilled people some much-needed job experience. Why don't gas stations have lot boys anymore? And why don't movie theaters have escorts with flashlights to help you to your seat? They used to. I'm not old enough to remember that, but there's a lot of people that remember that. These were just simple jobs that you got your foot in the door so that you could just get some job experience, for young people or unskilled people. I want every single fellow human on earth to make as much money as they need to have a fulfilling, free, and meaningful life. But minimum wage chops off the bottom rungs of the economic ladder for the most disadvantaged people in society. It prices those people out of a job who are the least skilled and least educated people. If the jobs of lot boys and movie theater escorts have completely vanished under the current minimum wage, imagine how many more poor people would be unemployed if we hiked it up to $15 an hour. I've been a mostly lucky guy, so it takes work for me to imagine how crappy of a childhood and school and family life that some people have had, to not have the productive value to be worth hiring at minimum wage prices. It's heartbreaking stuff. So really, what's worse than low wages is no wages. But most importantly, disadvantaged youth are missing out on getting very important job experience, like customer service skills, discipline, showing up on time, work ethic, and how to relate to a boss and coworkers, and a slew of other key skills that almost everyone completely forgets about when thinking about the lowest skilled jobs. Luckily for these poor and disadvantaged folks, once on the economic ladder, almost every single person climbs into a much higher income bracket by adulthood and middle age. Economic mobility is far greater than many would have you believe. 53% of American income earners are in the top 10% at some point in their lives. Typically, those making moral judgments about the changes over time of the percentage of total income of the top 1% or 10% or any other income bracket ignore the fact that flesh and blood human beings are not statistical categories. In the only 2 or 3 studies that have actually tracked individual income earners over time, one was based on IRS data. If we look at the real individual human beings who are in the bottom quintile, which is the bottom 20% of income earners, after 9 years, more of them moved into the top quintile than stayed in the bottom quintile. Over 91% of them moved into a higher bracket after those 9 years. So when we're talking about the richest 1% or 10% of people, or talking about the poorest 20% or 10% of people, we're not talking about the same people who are stuck in those categories as time goes on, especially the higher brackets, because the higher up on the income scale you look at, the less time those people spend in that income category. I mentioned earlier that the Nordic countries that many Democrats love have no minimum wage laws. They do use unions quite often, but that's a voluntary negotiation and interaction between people who are not being coerced by government enforcement. In the United States, we have government-enforced wages, with the threat of jail time or confiscation of property in the form of fines for non-compliance on what the government demands that you pay people, which causes unemployment for the most disadvantaged people in society. Highly developed countries with no minimum wage laws include Iceland, Singapore, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Switzerland. Singapore usually has an unemployment rate of about 2%, which is incredibly low, and their per capita incomes have been higher than America's at some points in time. America's GDP per person was $54,541 in 2018. In Singapore, it was $58,247 that same year. Also, most Democrats who praise Nordic countries like Sweden, Finland, and Denmark as the ideal demand a $15 minimum wage, which is a total contradiction. These same Democrats criticize Trump and the Republicans for cutting our corporate taxes to 21%, when Sweden has a 22% rate, Denmark has 22%, and Switzerland's corporate tax rate averages at 17.77%. They have a malicious double standard by saying that Trump and the GOP are evil for cutting corporate taxes to 21%, and Switzerland is a glorious socialist utopia that has a lower corporate tax rate and is actually a free market capitalist country. Shh, but don't tell anyone that, or they'll realize we're a bunch of frauds. Today, I'll mention just 2 of my top solutions for helping poverty. Number 1, we need intense focus on fixing our K-12 education in the United States. In America, before the state governments got involved in education in the late 1800s, the adult literacy rate was 97%. Now, about 1/6 of 4th through 6th graders are functionally illiterate, and 78% of them will remain so as adults, meaning about 13% of adults are functionally illiterate, giving us a 87% literacy rate. The Federal Department of Education was founded in 1979, and since then, spending per pupil has quadrupled after adjusting for inflation, so that's gone up 4 times. Yet, our proficiency in mathematics, science, reading and writing, etc. have dropped by about 10 to 20 places in the world rankings that rank by country, depending on which educational subject you look at. The problem is not because of insufficient education spending. The United States spends more money K through 12 than virtually any other country on the face of the earth.
In Washington, D.C., they have some of the highest expenditures per pupil and some of the lowest scores in the country. Also, a few years ago, out of the top 5 states in test scores, all of them were below the national average in expenditure per pupil. The education that millions of American kids are receiving is a national disgrace. Another example is the situation with schools in Baltimore, Maryland. In 13 of the 39 Baltimore schools, not a single student tested proficient in math, and in 6 other Baltimore schools, only 1% tested proficient in math. Of the 100 largest school districts in America, Baltimore ranks 4th in terms of spending per student. Hopefully, I've demonstrated to you that the idea of finances being the problem is simply nonsense. One of the solutions to this education problem, according to dozens of economists I've read, is to allow school choice. When kids are forced to go to one particular public school, based on geographic location, the school does not have to try to compete with other schools to get parents to send their kids there. They're forced to go regardless. There are poor minority families living in ghettos who send their children to affordable private charter schools. In many public schools in inner cities, the students are 2 to 4 years behind the national average in many subjects or more. However, in many private charter schools in these very same inner cities, the students are scoring on par with, and often better than, students in affluent suburbs whose parents make over $250,000 a year. In my opinion, other solutions to America's education problems are to abolish the Federal Department of Education, which has been a complete failure and totally counterproductive, and I think we should separate the government from education entirely. There are tons of very affordable private charter schools that poor people send their kids to, and that do a far superior job of teaching kids, which is proven by the test scores and academic proficiency of the students. My solution number 2 to poverty is abolish the minimum wage laws, or reduce them to a few dollars, allowing consensual wage negotiation, but create new ways to prevent and stop instances of non-consensual low wages due to coercion, deception, or any other actual exploitation that's discovered. Regarding the poorest Americans who are the intended beneficiaries of minimum wage, but are often priced out of a job since minimum wage laws can't boost people's human capital and productive value, sure, it would be more convenient if we could effectively use violence to solve this terrible problem, but I don't know how to avoid the bad side effects caused by economic incentives. You're probably thinking, huh? What violence? Well, first, one humble request. Since mistakes in moral philosophy can end in total disaster, like fascism, communism's 120 to 200 million person death toll, slavery, feudalism, crony state corporatism, etc., I ask you to please leave a comment if you think I make any logical or empirical mistakes in what I'm about to say. I'll explain the thing about violence. So, I know what I know now, not by denying I'm wrong, but accepting I'm wrong and discarding most past beliefs. So, is the following statement true? Political and social philosophies are products of moral philosophies. If so, ethics are probably the second most vital field of human knowledge. Spirituality is number 1 in my opinion. That's a whole nother thing. We'll have to talk about that in another episode. But think about it. Whenever someone wants a law or regulation passed, they're motivated by wanting to protect people from harm, or to stop something bad or immoral. So now, I'll explain the principles of how all laws and regulations function. Government coercion via laws and regulations, when illustrated with the clarifying power of empiricism, is this. Government agencies, using men with guns or the threat of men with guns, to enforce laws and regulations. If one violates a law or regulation, men with guns kidnap you and throw you in a concrete box, commonly referred to as jail or prison. Or,
you get a fine, which is merely the forced confiscation of your money, which if unpaid, results in men with guns kidnapping you and throwing you in jail. Initiating force or violence is immoral. Self-defense is a response to someone who initiates violence on you. So, if some dude is sitting on a chair in his backyard puffing a joint, and men with guns kidnap him for jail time, the government is acting immorally by initiating the use of violence on a non-violent peaceful person. That's why the drug war is indeed immoral. I don't lean Republican without sadly having to hold my nose at unjust policies. I'd vote for Democrats more often, but in my opinion, they're typically far more unjust. I'm often voting for the lesser of two evils in our modern political shitshow. Soon, I'll finally make a video on the logical and empirical proofs demonstrating the truth of the moral principle initiating force is immoral. In other words, using the scientific method to prove or disprove moral principles. Mathematics is not a subjective discipline, even though it's theoretical and optional. Morality is something that seems to lie within both the theoretical and physical world. It's optional, so it's not physical in the way that gravity is, but morality and immorality do have very real consequences in the physical world, whether applied to social systems or in your own life. In a similar way, whether we choose to abide by the rules of mathematics and the scientific method has very real consequences in the physical world. They are partly why we have modernity and can feed billions of people. For modernity to be possible, it also requires certain moral innovations that we have made over time and continue to make. The abolition of slavery and serfdom and the respect for property rights are an essential part of what fully unleashed the Industrial Revolution. Because of property rights, people felt secure enough to invest tons of resources, time, and energy into creating all the technology we have now. Why start a gold mine or invent something if criminals or the government are just going to take it from you? These are all very important questions. Without the moral principle of property rights, we would not have invented the technology that enables me to make this video or for you to listen to this. It seems to me that our political system is escalating its violations of property rights, which will result in what we could call an economic disaster. The evidence for this is pretty conclusive, and history is filled with it. From the fall of the Roman Empire to the poverty of modern Venezuela. Depending on how severely a civilization violates these ethical realities, determines just how impoverished its people will be. The more moral a society is, the more prosperity that it will earn and deserve. It's always been governments that impose the most slavery and serfdom on humanity and commit the most genocide and other immoral atrocities. More subtle forms of property rights violations, such as taxation, fees, fines, and so on, can and have become another form of slavery and serfdom, as they escalate over time. That is exactly how the Roman Empire decayed from within, until barbarian invaders finished it off. The great civilizations are ones that have protected life, liberty, and property. When they've stopped doing that, they have all crumbled. When the government has accumulated too much power, they have gradually stopped respecting life, liberty, and property every single time. In the present, with our fortunate and hard-won moral innovations in politics, including the abolition of slavery, civil rights, blind justice, and equality before the law, aside from the ruling class clearly being above the law, our more advanced and civilized political system masks the mass coercion and violence cleverly devised by the ruling class to conceal their political and economic exploitation of common citizens. With all recorded history regarding politics, the ruling class have used clever moral justifications for the government's violent coercion, and other clever ways of masking the perception of this coercion. Due to mass compliance, there's a sort of theater curtain blocking one's view of the violence and threats,
The violence only breaches the curtain once non-compliance is discovered by the government. Everything may look peaceful and hunky-dory, but that's merely mass compliance by citizens with the knowledge that non-compliance results in their kidnapping and jailing by armed government agents. This is why minimizing the prevalence of taxes, laws, and regulations is not only economically beneficial, but it's moral and righteous. We need to minimize these as much as possible. Politics and law should be collective self-defense against violent criminals, infringements on civil rights, foreign aggressors, and property crimes. By the way, property crimes, like all truly immoral actions, involve a violation of someone's consent, such as theft, fraud, destruction, embezzlement, Ponzi schemes, and so on. In future political discussions, I'd like to talk about fascism, after defining what it actually is, to demonstrate the fascist economics and the three other pillars of fascism that are in fact operating in our contemporary US political system. And in that video, I'll explain why I firmly believe President Trump is the greatest effective anti-fascist political figure in modern US history, fighting the fascist political policies of both the establishment GOP and especially the establishment DNC. Trump often has a huge ego and behaves like a narcissist. Thus, he's frequently defensive, reactive, petty, etc. But I support most of his policies, which have been very good for our country in my opinion. He has clear character flaws, as we all do, but through many excellent policies, he's made America a better place to live and work in. I'm grateful that we have his leadership, instead of what would have been a thoroughly disastrous Hillary Clinton administration. And that's all, folks. Thanks for tuning in. There's a link in the description to my Subscribestar account if you'd like to donate and help make this a full-time Monday through Friday show in the future. That's the eventual goal. If you'd like a full-time show, you can also help that happen by clicking like, sharing these videos, and comments help too. It'll boost up my videos in the algorithms. I hope you enjoyed the video, and give me any feedback you want. I'll make a video show in the future, but there's reasons I'm not right now. Thank you again for listening. Stay fly, long live philosophy, and I'll talk to you soon.